Good afternoon, and welcome to our New York Archives Magazine online speaker series. I'm Josie Madison, editor of New York Archives. Today, we will venture on a fascinating journey through the history of some of New York's short line railroads with retired Lieutenant Colonel Richard Comstock. Often overlooked in favor of the major lines, these smaller railroads played a vital role in connecting local communities, fueling commerce, and shaping the state's economy. We'll discover some of the stories of the trains, the towns they served, and the people who kept them running. Richard Comstock is chair of the Stewards Program at the New York State Archives Partnership Trust. He has an extensive background in military service. One of his many passions is the different railroads in our surrounding towns and neighborhoods, all throughout the great state of New York. Tom Ruller retired from his position as New York State Archivist, a role he held since 2015. An active professional for 35 years, he's the author of several peer-reviewed journal articles and reviews on the use of technology in archives and the preservation of records in electronic form. Tom has been a consultant for several state governments and other organizations focusing on electronic records management and preservation. He remains actively engaged as a board member and steward of the Archives Partnership Trust. So welcome to all of you who've joined us today. We will set aside a little bit of time at the end for a question and answer session. So as questions occur to you, please feel free to submit them using the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen, and we will get to as many of those as we can at the end. And now I'm pleased to introduce Richard Comstock and Tom Ruller.
Thank you very much, Josie. Richard, this is exciting. We've been talking about this for quite some time.
Exactly.
Everyone should know we're doing this from a train car here in Corinth, and we are extremely grateful to the Saratoga, Corinth, and Hudson Railroad for hosting us. And as a reminder to all of you, and you'll learn a little bit more about this later, you can come up and take a ride on the SCH. And so please, once Hal comes up and talks a little bit about it, take advantage of that. And we've got an audience. We've got a number of folks here who hopefully are going to help us make this presentation really great. And it is a really great presentation, Richard. And I know you've got a great PowerPoint, and I'm going to cue that up now so you can take over the mic.
Thank you, Tom. I appreciate that. And I appreciate all the in-person attendance as well as the online attendance. I think it's easy to say that most of us have seen at one time or another the archaeological remains of what once was a railroad and is now just a railroad bed, and have wondered why it was created, how it was created, and what happened to it at any point in time, and when it ultimately met its demise. Some have been converted to trails, and there's an extensive rails to trail program in New York State. And others, like the one we are with today, have actually reincarnated a line and made it into a working railroad. I think it's important to understand that in 1830, there were no railroads in New York State. Railroading was just beginning in England and just getting the attention of people on the other side of the pond, meaning us. But 30 years later, there were hundreds of short line railroads, and there was a reason for that, and which we're going to talk about. That reason basically was the Erie Canal. In my estimation, from what I've read, the experiences that I've had, the Erie Canal was a catalyst for the expansion of railroads, and the railroads were necessary in many cases to overcome some of the limitations with regard to the canal. 1812 demonstrated that a canal or some kind of transportation link between the Hudson River and New York City and the Erie, Lake Erie, was necessary. And we talked about that on an earlier online discussion. But the canal having been built, that it now fostered an interest in getting goods to market. And the question was, how do they get to market? And that's what we're going to talk about. And basically, the canal did have certain limitations. Travel on the canal was slow. The canal was weather dependent during the months of December, January, and February. it's quite possible that no canal traffic was going to be taking place. And canals by themselves needed some place to go besides just the Erie in order to get Lake Erie, in order to get goods to the canal to market. And so that was a difficult thing to overcome. Why? Because as you see in the slide that Tom has put up, the New York State topography basically is somewhat mountainous in the southern part of the state, and that created a problem for canal builders to overcome. So it wasn't, if you wanted to get your goods from Ithaca, New York, let's say, to Syracuse, a canal was not necessarily going to be the easiest thing to do. You could use the lakes, which ultimately they did, but there is still the issue of time and travel that would have to have been overcome. And
the slide that we've put up is an 1850s era map of New York State showing the locations of the railroads and the canals at that time. This is by the way, this particular map is available through the digital collections at the State Archives, but I'll turn it back to you.
No. And you can see that the Appalachian and Allegheny chains were an impediment to a lot of the canal building, which was north-south canal building. So I think that it's fair to say that the canal fostered incredible growth, but it also had certain limitations, which I think encouraged the development of railroads. The question we had is where to begin, and I think the answer was we begin at the beginning. And let's look at the first railroad that was established within the state. And that's what we're going to do. We're going to focus on that. And then I will tell you what we're going to do after we've gotten through with the first railroad, where we're going to go from there. In addition to talking about the thread across New York State by these short line railroads, we're also going to talk about the Saratoga, Corinth, and Hudson. And we're also going to talk about one of the other short line railroads in the Adirondacks, which was developed for a specific purpose. Railroads, the state of New York, if you will, in 1825, and again, 1825 is a benchmark year because of the development of the completion of the Erie Canal. Canal fever was a big thing in New York. The canal advocates believed that it was God's highway. Canal
detractors,
yeah, right. We still called it Clinton's Gulch, but the canal advocates also believed that the railroads were the invention of the devil. But the point was that we had a canal and there were limitations. At the same time, in England, there was a development of rail traffic, and the people or developers in the United States took notice of that, and I think there was a transfer of technology and expertise from England, which helped spawn the rail traffic in New York. Railroads were important, and they became important because they got goods to market. They got goods to the canal. And railroads ultimately became more important as the goods that they were transporting were perishable, because time was saved by using the railroads. Also, to get raw materials to industry, you had to get raw materials in order to build, plants and manufacturing facilities. And finally, and really the genesis of the first railroad, was transporting people, just to get people from one place to another. The development of railroading was an opportunity, I guess, or an impetus for the government to start getting involved in the transportation business. Obviously, tolls that were collected on the canal went to the state government as part of the compensation for the costs of building the canal. But there was also the need for the government to get involved when railroading started to be developed, to get involved with the not only the authorization of rail traffic but also the financing, and we'll see that a little bit later as to how important that was. Again, the canal was the genesis, if you will, of the railroading industry. Some of the other issues in short line railroads were the continuity of gauge railroads, gauges, track, the continuity of cars, which will ultimately have to link with possibly another railroad, if not the canal, and the continuity of handling freight and handling baggage, and all those had to be dealt with. The government controlled fares that originally that the railroads were able to charge. A high fare to those in government who got involved in the controversy between canal versus railroad favored a high revenue rate, if you will, for railroads, simply because it would make the canal more attractive, whereas the railroad advocates favored the lower rail rate, simply because it would bring more traffic to the rail line and take that traffic away from the canal. So there was some tension there. But generally, the rates that were charged were somewhere between 2 cents and 5 cents per mile per person. And freight was usually between 5 cents and 9 cents per ton mile. And those were the rates that generally came about as a result of the government involvement in the rail development. The biggest, I think, takeaway from the development of railroading was the development in technology. Rail design went through a great metamorphosis over the years. Differences in elevation, which were solved by the lock system on the canal, had to be overcome in building rails from one town or city or village to another. And the quality of the ground had to be dealt with. In the canal, you dug the ditch. In the railroad, you had to secure the rail onto the ground. And so those types of technological developments were constant throughout the life of the railroad. The types of commerce were also something that had to be dealt with, and passenger versus freight was important with regard to freight car design. It was important regarding fares. And it was important regarding continuity. That is, if you had one short line connecting with another short line, how does the freight and or baggage get moved from one to the other? Property acquisition was a big deal in developing the railroads. Oftentimes a railroad would be surveyed to go through private property, and therefore had to be effectively, that property had to be purchased. There was no eminent domain per se. The government did not help out in that regard. So the significant cost to the railroads was the cost of acquiring property from an individual landowner. And finally, a lot of the estimates that railroaders forecasted in developing a rail line were at the beginning seriously underestimated. So there were always significant overruns in terms of the early rail lines. The next,
I think it's important in New York, the railroads were regulated by the railroad commissioners, and the railroads were required to submit annual reports. And there's a lot of course, I'm plugging the archives, which that's what I do. But we've got a lot of those railroad reports going back to the early part of the 19th century, which help people understand the government's role in oversight of the railroads and tracing the development of those railroads.
Next.
Yep.
Excellent. This is just an outline of the short line railroads, which complemented and or competed with the canal, and it led to ultimately in 1853 the acquisition by the New York Central Railroad and the consolidation of them into what we would know as the New York Central water line, water level route. The starred lines are the ones that basically form the backbone or the spine between Albany and Buffalo. You can see in the next slide, this is taken out of an old book on the genesis of the New York Central Railroad. But you can see from the right, the first line being the Mohawk and Hudson, which is the first line in New York State. The second, obviously, being the Utica and Schenectady, and then the Syracuse to Utica, Auburn to Syracuse, Auburn to Rochester, the Tonawanda, and the Attica to Buffalo, which completed the cross-country or cross-state, I should say, line. And effectively, other lines followed. The Rochester, Lockport, Niagara Falls, as well as the Rochester to Syracuse, which basically eliminated Auburn and some of the towns in between Auburn and Rochester.
And the Mohawk and Hudson, the first railroad in New York State, was completed shortly after the first railroad in the United States was completed, the B&O. So New York was an early implementer of this technology, which helps explain the complexity that they had and the problems they had to deal with in figuring out how do you do this.
Right, exactly. And that's why the technology is so important in the development of the railroad. Frank Stevens' book, the map before that you saw about the linking of the railroads, the short lines, was out from a book written by a fellow by the name of Frank Stevens in 1926, which was entitled "The Beginnings of the New York Central Railroad." This also comes from his book. It's a reiteration to a certain extent of 2 slides earlier, but I thought it would be helpful for you to see not only when they were incorporated, but when they were open.
So this is a graphic of all of those railroads that Richard just talked about, and when, as he said, when they were initiated and when they were completed. So the Mohawk and Hudson initiated 1826, completed 1831, all the way to the most, I'll say the most recent one, or the oldest one, or oldest last one, the Rochester, Lockport, and Niagara Falls Railroad, which was initiated in 1850 and completed in 1852. So it's a great piece of information.
Yeah, and some of the ones in the later years were, you see 5 years for the Mohawk and Hudson, 3 for the next, 5 for the Tonawanda, but there's reasons for that, which we'll talk about. But the germination time was much less as the technology and the expertise got greater. This is simply out of Stevens's book. It's a notice that application will be made to the legislature to permit the incorporation of a Mohawk and Hudson Railroad. The capital of $300,000 would be authorized by the legislature and would be allowed to be increased to $500,000 if necessary.
So this is a graphic. It's a picture from the newspaper clipping.
And in fact, this also appears in the archives in the report, the annual reports to the Railroad Commission. The Mohawk and Hudson satisfied the need. The need was to get people and later goods easily from the Hudson, that is Albany, to the Mohawk, and that is the Erie Canal. The Mohawk's route was 16 miles. And the trip involved, if you took it by canal, it was a lengthy process. It was a day's process to get from Albany to basically to Schenectady, where we would link in with the canal. Reason being, we're going to see a map of the route, but the reason being not only the length of the trip, the speed with which a canal boat or any kind of boat would travel, and the fact that there were locks in between Albany and Schenectady, which had to be passed through and which took additional time to get it done.
This is a map showing that shortcut. Basically, you're cutting the corner, going straight from Albany to the canal in Schenectady. And if you look at the route of the canal, even today, it's 7 locks just to get to Schenectady. And that's a shorter lift, but the lift at Waterford is one of the highest lifts in the country. So all of that had to happen in order to make that trip on the canal. The railroad really cut down the amount of time, as Richard says.
The first, we use the term influencer today in today's world, that people are influencers. The first influencer was a fellow by the name of, I'm not going to pronounce it because the way he pronounces it is Fenshaw, George W. Fenshaw, who was really a railroad pioneer. And he knew that the railroad needed to be built to simply save time to get from one place to another. And he enlisted the help of Stephen Van Rensselaer to engage in what I'll call lobbying. We would today call lobbying for sure. The lobbying of the legislature to allow the authorization, or to pass the authorization act to get the Mohawk and Hudson started. Fenshaw was involved. Fenshaw was an early investor, and Fenshaw did resign after a series of setbacks. He was replaced by an individual by the name of John Jervis. And Jervis is, if you know Port Jervis, John Jervis was the engineer who finished and rerouted the original plans for the Mohawk and Hudson, and basically became the engineer for a number of the more western links in this chain. The government approved the application of the Mohawk and Hudson and authorized its establishment. However, the original charter included 2 items which had to be negotiated away. One was the shareholders of the line were personally liable for anything that would happen to the railroad or anyone traveling on the railroad. And 2, the state had the opportunity within a 5-year period to basically reimburse the railroad for its costs and take possession of the railroad. Now, this is clearly an attempt by the government to make sure that they had control over the fortunes of the canal, because otherwise there would really be an issue. Those 2 provisions were modified and eliminated, and ultimately eliminated, so that personal liability and the 5-year buyback was no longer a provision of their charter.
I think your point about protecting the canal, it comes down to sort of this. The government owned and operated the canal. The railroads were private industry.
Right.
And so you've got to walk in 2 camps there if you're a government official. How do you promote this new technology, and how do you protect your investment in the public's property?
Exactly. I emphasize raising capital. Raising capital was effectively acquiring shares of stock. But in those days, shares of stock were not acquired by simply going out and writing a check for all the shares that you wanted to buy. Basically, you would buy in shares, but it would be a subscription. So effectively, if you bought 100 shares, you'd have to pay something down, but then you would be required to make good on that subscription over a period of time, typically to coincide with the progress of the line being constructed, so that shareholders could be could be required under the subscription agreement to make payments over a specific period of time. This has significance. The reason I pointed out is in 1837 there was a financial panic, and this became a real problem. Pricing was an interesting. There was only one fare. As part of the charter, the Mohawk and Hudson was prohibited from carrying freight. So there was only originally there was only passenger fares, and the passenger fare was 3 cents a mile. So roughly 16 miles of track was roughly $50 to 50 cents to $50, 50 cents to basically ride the rails from Albany to basically Schenectady. And when we say ride the rails, I think it's interesting to note, and this goes back to the idea that the development of the railroads involved incredible amount of technological advancement. But basically, a rail, as you might think about it, is a piece of iron or steel. The nomenclature rail for the Mohawk and Hudson was nothing more than a wooden piece of long piece of wood. And basically, the next page is a diagram coming out of Stevens's book that basically shows you how the rail is constructed. Basically, the rail is nothing more than a wooden rail, if you will, and a metal iron strap on top that basically guides the train over its course. Those rails are set on concrete blocks, and those concrete blocks and those rails are affixed to the concrete block by what they call a chair, which is the little on the bottom, the transverse section of the diagram. You can see those little chairs that are on the bottom of the wooden rail, and basically that is the rail that originally was constructed. I'll talk a little bit later about the as the rail wore over a period of time, that rail began to separate from the wooden, or the strip began to separate from the wooden rail, or from the wooden rail, and basically could cause some damage. Ground was broken on for the Mohawk and Hudson. Again, don't forget, in 1826 they looked at the authorization, but by 1830 the ground was broken, and the rail line was actually completed in 1831. Again, only 16 miles. It was a big deal when the line was open, and everybody from the governor to all local officials were involved in that maiden run. The first locomotive or first engine to power the Mohawk and Hudson was known as the DeWitt Clinton, obviously after the governor, and future locomotives. A future locomotive which came in to compete with the DeWitt Clinton was known as the John Bull. We'll see in the next two slides the DeWitt Clinton. You can see the primitive nature of the rail. You can see the primitive nature of the locomotive, and you can see the primitive nature of the cars which are transporting the passengers. Those cars are nothing more than stagecoaches, which have been mounted on to a super or structure that trucks, which they call trucks, the wheels that basically keep the cars online. And John Bull was an English made. George and Robert Stephenson, brothers in England, were very involved in the development of railroading in England, and from where the U.S. got a lot of its information and a lot of its technology. The thing that I would point out, and in the verbiage below, is this is the first engine to have a cowcatcher. You can see a cowcatcher in the front, and it's the first engine to have a headlight, which is that rectangular box in the front, in front of the smokestack.
And both of those engines are wood-fired, which introduced other complexities. We don't have to go into that today.
When we talk about cost, though, very quickly, the wood firing meant two things. Number one, there had to be along the road, and this will get more important as the short lines become longer lines. Along the road, there would have to be a woodshed, and there would have to be a watering facility. So in order to basically service the the engine or the locomotive as it was hauling from one point to another. Those facilities would have to be in place. The next railroad, and again, I started to pull the thread, and once I got through the Mohawk and Knudsen, we decided that we would take it from there to Buffalo, and that's what we did. That's what we're doing. The Utica and Schenectady Railroad was incorporated in 1833. It went into service in 1836. Its toll rate was 4 cents a mile, and this was one of the longest of the legs of the short lines in New York, was 78 miles. Because it was so close to the canal, it could only carry passengers and their baggage, the same as the Mohawk and Hudson. But this introduces a concept which we're going to talk about or allude to later, and that is, if I get on in Albany and I put my baggage there, how do I and my baggage get, and the same problem you have today with connecting flights, right? How do I get my baggage from one to another? And this will be a problem that has to be sorted out over time, but what was a real issue at one point in time. By 1846, the Utica and Schenectady was able to haul freight. But again, there was pressure to do freight for a lot of reasons, and not the least of which were the limitations on the canal, weather and speed. This is interesting. The Utica and Schenectady, the way the railroad is nomenclatured, it's where you start the railroad, and the second town or the second name is where it ends. Railroads were built from west to east, not east to west. And the question is, why? And the answer is because if you build from west to east, you know where you're going, because there's a terminus that's already been built. So you can get there. And the only time this didn't work was with another railroad further west to Tonawanda, when they started building from east to west. So the line was built from Utica to Schenectady. And unlike the subscription of stock for the Mohawk and Hudson, which was mostly subscribed to by investors from New York City, the way that the charter for the Utica and Schenectady worked is that the allocation of subscriptions would be done by counties through which the railroad ran. So if it went through 3 different counties based on population or other factors, the ability to subscribe would be allocated to each of those counties. And the theory being, by allocating it by county, you would basically get county involvement. People would be more involved. People would be more, quote, invested literally and figuratively into the railroad. The next slide is just a portrayal of costs. It's nothing more than giving you an idea of what costs typically were. And you can see one of the things that is a fairly significant cost, and that is, the first 3 costs are fairly significant, but the timber and superstructure construction, again, when your rails are wooden, timber is going to be more expensive. The interesting thing is the grading and land alteration is expensive because you're dealing with levels that have to be graded properly. And the acquisition of title and the fencing of property was also a big deal. And the state exacted stipulated that the Utica and Schenectady had to purchase the shares of the Mohawk Turnpike Company, which was an overland stage operation that was, for all intents and purposes, being basically put out of business by the railroad. Other issues. We tend to think of railroads and telegraphs. In the development of these railroads, it's important to remember that Samuel Morse applied for his patent in 1837, and it was granted in 1840. And so there were no there was no telegraph service whatsoever with regard to most of these railroads until 1845, and so it was even after the patent was granted in 1840. There was still a lot of development that took place. The passenger rate of $3.12 or 4 cents, roughly 4 cents a mile, was reduced to 2 in 1846, and the reason was just to keep the rail kind of going, and then the year later, or not keep it going, but to keep the demand up, and a year later it was increased, and that was due in part to what was going on in 1837 with regard to the panic, as well as the need to replace outdated equipment. The Syracuse and Utica, again, was a west to east railroad. It was incorporated in 1836 with an authorization of $800,000. $800,000. It was allowed to carry freight. However, this is the first time that they were allowed to carry freight, but they had to pay a toll to the state, again, to compensate the canal during times where the canal was navigable. When the canal was not navigable, during mostly the December, January, February timeframe, there was no toll to be paid. The total length of this line was 53 miles, and it opened in 1839. This is the first time that engineers had to deal with the issue of not such good swampy land that ultimately caused a problem which had to be solved. And for those of you who've ridden along the thruway from Albany to Buffalo, you certainly know that there are some swampy land between actually Syracuse and Utica, and then Syracuse and Auburn. But basically, that engineering problem was solved by burying to the tune of 10 feet pilings that had to be there to effectively secure the rail. The next slide is basically, I think, an interesting one. Being out of a finance background, I always gravitate towards these numbers, but they do tell a tale. This is very similar to the kind of operating results you see from other rail lines. But the revenues in 1840, total of 194,000, basically was consisted of passenger and freight and some other, but the freight percentage of the total revenue was 0.8%. When you get to 1847, where you have $11,743 and $52,494.46 out of the total revenues, it's 14%. So you can see that what's happening here is that freight revenue is starting to take hold, and basically people are in point of fact, during the navigable times, irrespective of tolls, are starting to use more these railroads more for freight, and this is a consistent sort of trend with regard to all of the various short line railroads. The other thing I'd point out is you can see the operating expenses from 1844 to 1847 have increased, and this has to do a lot with the repair and replacement of things that had just got worn out.
So we've got a chart that shows the revenues and expenses of the railroad from 1840 to 1847, and the columns are passenger revenue, freight revenue, other revenue, total revenue, and then operating expenses, and then the simple math of the net income.
Somebody might ask, what are the other revenues? In large measure, those are the tolls. The Auburn and Syracuse, again, this is was incorporated in 1834, went into service in 1839, 26 miles. And it now created an access to the canal at Syracuse, which was a physical, one of the times that the railroad actually physically touched and it was necessary to get to the canal, and that's one of the impetus for the Auburn and Syracuse. There was big elevation issues with regard to getting to Auburn. It was deemed to be 274 feet higher than Syracuse, and that created the need to have an inclination of roughly 30 feet per mile in order to accommodate that difference. So you can see that there's a long run up in order to get to that, to get simply 274 feet. Financial panic of 1837 really caused a major problem with regard to the completion of railroads and the beginning of others. The original subscription for stock, which was generally after the Mohawk and Hudson, was by county, didn't preclude the investor from selling his or her subscription. And many of the New York City investors were focused on buying those subscriptions and believed in the railroads. And therefore, the 1837 did cause a panic because, again, they were dependent on a program of payment over a period of time, and that wasn't going to happen if there was a financial crisis. The state came to the aid of the railroads generally, and I'm using this Auburn and Syracuse as an example, by offering public debt to effectively finance them and loan them the money to avert a halt in construction. So by January, because of the panic, only 22 and a half miles of the total mileage was completed, and they used horsepower to get to the rest of to get to Auburn. And the company again was authorized an increase in its fare to 5 cents a mile in order to be able to kind of bail itself out. The Auburn and Rochester was the first to go to east to west, and basically was incorporated in 1836 and went into service in 1841. You can see there's a little bit longer timeline, and that was really due to the 1837 panic. This one was departed significantly from the canal and went through Seneca Falls, Waterloo, Geneva, Canandaigua, and Victor. But the shares, again, subscription to shares would be by county, so that the biggest shareholding was in the area of Canandaigua, and Canandaigua ultimately became the headquarters for the Auburn and Rochester. Unfortunately, the Rochester terminus, again, east to west, was not where its next railroad had already had its terminus. So there was a gap in Rochester between where the Tonawanda Railroad, which we're going to discuss, and began, and where the Auburn and Rochester ended. So again, the company's charter was limited to its ability to haul freight while the canal was navigable. Auburn and Rochester stock was fixed at $2 million, and it was another long short line that was approximately 78 miles long. A couple of things that came about. There was a sort of an aha moment with the Auburn and Rochester, and they realized that some of the railroads had not been double tracked, and they needed to be in order to be able to not only haul freight and passengers separately, but also just to keep a higher volume or velocity of rail traffic. And so this was an epiphany for railroaders who started to see railroading as something more than just getting to getting to Buffalo, but really getting to the West through the Great Lakes. And we'll talk a little bit about that in a minute. Again, the useful life of track you remember how tenuous the track was to begin with. The useful life of the track was really kind of at its end, and these wooden rails and foundations were not up to the increase in traffic, and iron, which were the strips that you saw, were being replaced, and rails were being redesigned to look more like the rails you see today. And they were basically iron was being substituted, steel was being substituted for iron. The directors of the Auburn and Rochester appealed to Rastus Corning, who was at that point in time not only a director, he was a director of the Utica and Schenectady, but they appealed to him saying, we should do something about this. Passengers should be allowed to pay fares for the full distance from point A, being Albany and or wherever they started, through wherever they went, irrespective of the fact that they would have to go from rail line to rail line. They figured they also appealed to some kind of a way to deal with baggage placement and baggage ticketing to make that more efficient. And express service from Albany to Rochester should be given a favorable rate, again, to stimulate the traffic. The Tonawanda Railroad was incorporated. It's very short. It was incorporated in 1832. Went into business in 1837. The plan was for the Tonawanda to go from Rochester to Attica. However, it was not until 1841 that it was extended past Batavia. The railroad was quite content to keep the ending at Batavia. There was a lot of commerce that was to be had there, and there was no impetus to go to Attica as planned. However, the Attica and Buffalo became incorporated in 1836 and basically went into operation in 1842. That rail line was 30 miles, but it would go from Attica to Buffalo, and that was the impetus to get the Tonawanda to extend its reach to Attica. And basically, the appeal that the Auburn and Rochester directors had basically came or resulted in a meeting of all the companies in 1850, and their objective was to standardize, which they did in many of these situations, fare differentials, fixing of fares on first class passengers, requiring only certain stops, more express, for watering and a change of cars, and the consistency in baggage handling, and a policy for free rides. Free passes were a thing of in vogue at the time, from the time of the Mohawk and Hudson. Next slide, we're going to talk a little bit, and Hal is here and is going to come up and tell you a little bit about this, the Saratoga, Corinth, and Hudson, which is the facility from which we're right. Broadcasting here. And
so now in New York, we have a complete east-west connection, which is the New York Central. But there are a lot of railroads that are being built that are going north-south to connect to either the canal or to those other railroads. And this is a great example. So Hal, I'm going to turn this chair over to you. There's a picture on the screen here. This is the rail car that we're sitting in right now. That's courtesy of Hal and his folks.
Just a little about how the question that comes up is, so the Saratoga, Corinth, and Hudson was a railroad, a functioning railroad, and the answer is not quite, right, Hal? This was born by you out of a series of track that was the Adirondack branch, correct?
Of the Delaware and Hudson.
Yeah. And as I understand it, Hal, this that ultimately went from Saratoga up to North Creek.
Correct. Originally built by Thomas Durant from Saratoga Springs to North Creek, extended in the 1940s all the way up to the iron ore mines at Dawes. The Adirondack Railway was absorbed into the Delaware and Hudson Corporation, and this line ended up being the Delaware and Hudson's Adirondack branch.
And can you tell us a little bit about your plans and your sort of your vision with regard to this? Because for those of you who are not familiar with the and those of you out in the audience who are not familiar with the Saratoga, Corinth, and Hudson, it is a working line, and currently has the audience have an opportunity to basically travel on this excursion, if you will, but you have other plans. And could you just tell us a little bit about that?
It started with just getting this line back open. The railroad ceased operating in 2017. We reopened it in May of 2022 as the Saratoga, Corinth, and Hudson Railway. We operated on about 17 miles of track between Corinth and Saratoga Springs. Our dinner trains, our scenic trains, and our various holiday themed trains. Very popular. Last year we did close to 42,000 passengers. We've had significant increase every year of ridership. It's our 5th season this year, so that's a big deal for us to make it this far. But we started from nothing. It was just a couple locomotives and a few cars, family and friends that helped me get this going. I've been in the railroad industry close to 30 years now, and through those railroad connections, we were able to get this operating and continue to see this railroad doing well and succeeding. But it's a great line. You don't want to see lines get torn up or abandoned. So us operating and being successful keeps this up and going, and it paves the way for future opportunities, transload, freight opportunities, things like that in this area. And those are always possibilities, and we're always things that we're looking at or considering if they make economic sense. But anything that can help the economy, help with jobs, help get materials here. But at the end of the day, just having a way for folks to enjoy this beautiful area and help promote tourism keeps the rail shiny right now.
You talk about transloads. Could you just real quickly just kind of give us a little idea of what that vision?
Well, transloads are very popular right now for commodities, where things come in by rail and then get loaded onto truck to distributed to other local centers, such as lumber, propane, feed for farmers, plastics, things like that. That's all very successful stuff in other locations right now, and could potentially fit in this area down the road. But right now we're just focusing on keeping this line restored and up and going. We had to make significant changes and upgrades to keep it going, fixing crossings, bridges, track. We'll be putting in ties this year and doing 2 bridge decks over 2 bridges, as well as resurfacing railroad crossings. So there's a lot of work that goes into it. We do all the work in-house ourselves here.
I think that's what's so impressive to me is the amount of work that you and your associates basically put into this line. It's really remarkable, and I really encourage anybody who can to take advantage of coming here for just a marvelous opportunity.
We say it's a 7-day-a-week love affair with trains.
There you go.
It really is.
You're
always working on something or another.
And there is as you point out, there is a website here we put on here, and I want to publicly thank Hal for being so generous with this time and with this facility and with this people that who've been just nothing but great. So
no problem. We love opening our doors. And like this car you're on today, this was built in 1950s for the Seaboard Coastline. It was later an Amtrak service, but all of our equipment is pretty vintage. Our oldest car going back to 1916, our Pullman car on the back, and a lot of our locomotives that are historic and to this area. Three of our locomotives were original Delaware and Hudson locomotives that were original to this line. They came here in 1952 when they were built to replace steam locomotives, which were setting forest fires in the Adirondacks. So we brought these engines home. We're restoring them all, but it's having equipment on its home rails is historically significant, and that's what we love doing, is preserving the history and educating people about this. And essentially, we're a linear museum for folks to get out and learn the history of the rails and on this great line. And I mean, it's historically significant. This was Teddy Roosevelt's ride to the presidency,
right,
from North Creek. So very historic line. Our opening weekend starts on Memorial Day. It's our 5-year anniversary this year. So we're doing $5 train rides all Memorial Day weekend. So
That's great.
jump online at corinthtrain.com. You can get tickets there, but come up and visit us.
We will. We will. Hal, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you for everything. Well, I can't tell you how impressive it is to be here and to see these vintage cars and to talk to the people who are truly railroad devotees, for the lack of a better word. But they're very much into what they do, and they do a wonderful job. The last short line I'd like to talk about is the Adirondack and St. Lawrence. And it was incorporated in 1906, 20th Century Rail Line. And it was basically established in order to provide transportation for fool's gold pirates, which there is a town called Pirates, but the mine, the St. Lawrence Pyrites Company, began mining operations in 1890. It closed down and reopened, and it needed a way to get its goods to market. Like we talked about earlier, one of the genesis of these short line railroads was getting goods to market. And in this particular case, it had to get goods from a mine, and that is the pyrite, or to a connection in DeKalb Junction, a town which currently exists, that it would allow it to connect with the New York Central. The government was very interested in this particular railroad, which is one of the reasons I pulled it out, simply because of the commodity that it was hauling. Pyrite is used in the production of pulp, paper, and gunpowder, and particularly during the 1916 to 1919 period, the government did get involved in making sure that it monitored the transportation of those goods. The next is just showing you what it's like to run a railroad in the North Country. And basically, this is a picture or a photo that was taken in 1908 of a locomotive and ostensibly a freight assemblage getting through the snow, and it again emphasizes to me the difficulties involved in running a railroad up here.
And that locomotive is on the Adirondack and St. Lawrence.
Yes.
So it's
yep. Mm-hmm. Sometimes railroads had to be a little bit creative, and another reason I like this line is because they also got got the Mutual Milk and Cream Company interested in their operation, their railroad operation, and basically allocated or allowed them to use some property which they owned to set up their own transfer and use the railroad in order to haul dairy products to DeKalb Junction to meet up with the New York Central and basically ship them to wherever they needed to go. They also engaged syrup manufacturers as well as lumber companies to use their line, and they, in some cases, these companies built mills and storage facilities right in the vicinity of the rail line. Sometimes this involved spur lines, but nonetheless, they built their facilities nearby. And again, by 1921, the mines were closed, and the dairy business, which was ultimately transferred to Nestle at the time, closed down its facility nearby. And by 1925, the rolling stock was sold and the tracks were all removed. There's no rails to trail available there. And the company was dissolved in 1927.
And I think that that railroad is a good example of the dozens, maybe even 100 small short line railroads all over the state that went into areas that you couldn't physically get to with water. but needed to have the opportunity for manufacturers to get their goods or the raw materials in and out. You know, my favorite, of course, is the Fonda Johnstown in Gloversville, which supported the leather industry. You know, that there's a rail trail for that now. But all over the state, particularly in the Adirondacks and in down towards the Catskills, there are a lot of those kinds of examples. We could spend 3 months talking about all those railroads, and maybe we'll do that today. No, we won't. Josie, I think we've got some questions that have come up. We're going to leave this. We're back to that map of New York with the canals and the railroads from the 1850s, just as a way to sort of highlight the tremendous diversity and the coverage of all these things. And again, this is before even more railroads were built. So I'm going to close our PowerPoint and turn it over to you, Josie, for some questions.
Yeah, well, first of all, a lot of people made some comments about their kind of recreational experiences with these short line railroads, which I think you were kind of alluding to, Tom. A lot of people have done rail trail hikes or skiing on these lines. Somebody mentioned they went on a rail bike along an abandoned railroad track. So people are still using these lines, even ones that are not still in use. But we do have a couple of questions, and one is just about, are there any kind of broader resources on the history of these and other railroads across the state, including the ones in the Adirondacks, but in other parts of the state as well? Do you recommend any books?
Yes, there are. We do have there's a bibliography which I think might get handed out.
There's a so Richard has compiled a great bibliography of resources, and if you registered for this program, you're going to get a link, an email from us with a copy of this bibliography that'll answer all those questions and whet your appetite for more research, but also a link to the recording of this program and any other resources.
I'm going to plug one because the author is still with us. Many of the books that I use are dated in 1920, 1940, and what have you. But there is a book by a gentleman by the name of Timothy Starr called The Railroad Wars of New York, which is a good kind of look at the development of railroading, and it includes the Mohawk and Hudson and the development of those other lines that forged themselves across New York State. There is a book. The book that I've used a lot was a book by Frank Walker. Called The Beginning of the New York Central Railroad, which was published in 1926. But again, some of those diagrams that we use, some of the statistics we use, particularly the statistics, can be found in the New York State Archives as well.
Great.
If you're interested in the North Country, there's a book called Rails of the North Woods, Histories of 9 Adirondack Shortline Railroads, which was published in 1978, authored by Richard Allen and William Grove. Those are the two, but there are others as well that you might be interested in.
So watch your email for that message from us.
We have another question. One of our attendees' great uncle was the manager of the first Grand Central Station in New York City. And so the question is, was this a central station for short lines coming into New York?
Not really. Well, first of all, it was a terminal. So if you're really a stickler for nomenclature, it's Grand Central Terminal because the line ended. That was the end of the line, as they say. But no, the short lines. I don't know of any. The Grand Central Terminal was really, a New York centric terminal, but it's a good question and one that I would like to just maybe look at a little bit more. But to my knowledge, there were no short lines. I'm not including commuter lines at this point in time. New York Central did have some short lines which came down from Westchester and that area that were shorter lines. They were branches of the New York Central Railroad.
Right. So when we look at my goodness, why can't I think the Metro North lines?
Mhm.
A lot of that is those are the vestiges
Right.
of the New York Central's short commuter lines.
Right. And there were, I mean, the Harlem, the Hudson from west to east, the Hudson, the Harlem, and the New Haven lines were well, actually, the New Haven line was really part of the New Haven Hartford Railroad. But anyway, yeah.
What's next, Josie?
So I think these two questions are related, but here is where my lack of knowledge about railroads will shine. But can you address the Hudson and Saratoga Railroad and I believe a reopening of the Delancey and Voorheesville spur in 2026 happened? I think those are related questions.
Yeah, I cannot. I mean, I know of it, but I don't know too much more about it. I don't know whether you've
I don't.
had any. I haven't. There is you can look up some of the historic lines such as this that are still in operation.
And I'm sure some of those resources in the bibliography will be helpful
Yeah.
for some of those kind of more specific questions. So I think that does it for our questions for today. So I just want to say thank you to you, Richard and Tom, and thank you to Hal, who is no longer on screen, but for having a cameo appearance today. We really appreciate that. And thank you to all of you who joined us today. If you're interested in learning more about the records relating to railroads or any other subject at the State Archives, that website is archives.nysed.gov. And if you're interested in the programs that we offer, but from the New York State Archives Partnership Trust, my goodness, that website is nysarchivestrust.org. It's our privilege to make these events available to you and to keep New York State's history alive. If you're interested in the content we create and you have ideas for future programs, please send us an email at aptrust@nysed.gov. We're always happy to hear those ideas. And as Tom mentioned, a recording of this session along with relevant links and also registration for our next speaker series will all be in the thank you email that you'll get this week. And please join us on June 2nd at 12:30 p.m. for our next online speaker series, New Eyes on Alice, Queering the Museum with Victoria Monroe. You can find out more and register for that program at nysarchivestrust.org and in our thank you email. Thanks.
Richard, are you going to whistle us out?
Train is going to leave the station.
Yes. Oh, no. Well, thank you. Have a wonderful day, everyone.